The leadership of the Soviet Union has steadfastly advocated a program of encouraging and supporting revolutions in non-communist countries. By the early 1960s, special training centers had been established at the Lenin Institute and the Patrice Lumumba University, both in Moscow, and also one at Simferopol in the Crimea. Additional centers were set up in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and North Korea. Recruits from all over the world received intensive instruction in the use of light weapons, explosives, guerrilla warfare, and propaganda. By the mid-1960s, Cuba had been added to the list of terrorist training centers, and in January of 1966 was the host to an international meeting held there called the Tricontinental Conference. It was attended by over 500 representatives of 83 terrorist groups. The purpose of the meeting was to establish strategy and channels of communication for instigating civil war within the non-communist nations on the tricontinents of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This operation was placed under the supervision of Cuban intelligence, called the DGI. Cuba has trained and supplied literally thousands of terrorists from scores of countries in Africa and South America, particularly the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the Tupamaros in Uruguay, and the FMLN in El Salvador.
As a kid growing up, my grandmother...
Larry Grathwohl became a member of the Weather Underground organization as an undercover operative for law enforcement agencies in Cincinnati. His role within the organization was to carry directives from the Central Committee to the operating units in the field.
Most of the people that had no prior experience, let's say the average weatherman, if there is such a thing, they sent to Cuba for training in Cuba. And I also know that the DGI is controlled by the KGB.
As the Soviet connection with international terrorism became increasingly obvious, the KGB made a tactical decision to establish training centers in countries that generally are not regarded as communist. In this way, the Soviets could disclaim responsibility.
But let's get back to the subject of terrorism. It's obvious, I think, that no government is going to be toppled merely by a few bombs in public places, hostages held for ransom, or even by the assassination of public figures. And so it's equally obvious that terrorism as such is not viewed by Marxist-Leninists as a mechanism for the seizure of power. To the professional revolutionary, terrorism is but one tactic out of many in a larger strategy of total war. It's not in the killing or the destruction, but in the psychological impact upon the population. In fact, it can be stated as a general law of terrorism that its objective is to weaken a target government, not by confronting its military force, but by causing its civilian population to react in ways that will undermine the nation. In other words, the action is in the reaction.
A nation's economy is a delicate balance of forces, and it responds almost instantaneously to bad news. When people have doubts about the future, they become cautious in their spending. It doesn't take many acts of terrorism before the population begins avoiding unnecessary travel and staying away from public places, the shops and the restaurants. Sales fall off and profits decline. Investors move their savings out of the country to more politically stable areas. Goods become scarce and unemployment rises. Food shortages become a way of life. As the economy is weakened, the government is weakened. And this is brought about not by the direct action of terrorists, but by the reaction of the people. Thus, it is one of the calculated objectives of terrorism. All Marxist-Leninists are familiar with a small book called the Mini Manual for Urban Guerrillas, written by Carlos Marighella, a former leader of the Communist Party of Brazil. The Mini Manual gives complete instructions on every aspect of weaponry, deployment of forces, and the use of terrorism. And then it says, the government has no alternative except to intensify repression. The police roundups, house searches, arrests of innocent people make life in the city unbearable. The general sentiment is that the government is unjust, incapable of solving problems, and resorts purely and simply to the physical liquidation of its opponents. The urban guerrilla must become more aggressive and violent, resorting without let-up to sabotage, terrorism, expropriations, assaults, kidnappings, and executions, heightening the disastrous situation in which the government must act. In a booklet entitled Political Guerrilla Warfare, Feltrinelli said that the task of the terrorist was, and these are his words, to violate the law openly, challenging and outraging institutions and public order in every way. Then, when the state intervenes as a result with police and the courts, it will be easy to denounce its harshness and repressive dictatorial tendencies. In Germany, Ulrike Meinhof of the Red Army fraction explained it this way. She said, "It is necessary to provoke the latent fascism in society, and then the people will turn to us for leadership."
Here then is the third benefit of terrorism, in the form of not the action itself, but the reaction of the public. Terrorism eventually forces the government to take drastic measures which the public finds distasteful. Calculated provocation on the part of the revolutionaries leads inevitably to disastrous events and martyrs for the cause. Revolutionary propagandists present these as evidence that the government is repressive. The major part of the population may still reject the position of the revolutionaries, but many now will begin to view their own government as no better than the terrorists themselves. And still others will go further and join forces with the revolutionaries to combat the apparent injustices. This is a huge step forward in the development of a domestic revolution, because it isolates the government from the moral support of its own people and sets the stage for the final conflict, which will be fought by relatively small numbers, while the vast majority must be counted on to remain neutral. Now, we have spoken so far only about terrorism from the left, the Marxist-Leninists who dream of socialism and communism.
The killing or torture of the very people who supposedly are being liberated is an important feature of all Marxist-Leninist revolutions. It is through this tactic that the terrorists are able to frighten segments of the population into supporting them. With a sufficiently bloody campaign, a small band of terrorists can establish the equivalent of a second government over the people. They actually collect taxes. They issue laws and administer punishment to anyone who disobeys those laws. But most of all, they demand loyalty. They expect massive turnouts for their rallies, enthusiastic support of their general strikes, and they especially want the young people as eager recruits into their ranks. When these things begin to happen, the revolution is well on its way. Nothing could be more devastating to a government than to have segments of its population fall under the control of its enemy. And yet this is exactly what happens through terrorism, not as a result of military confrontation, but because of a civilian reaction to fear.
I brought up the subject of what's going to happen after we take over the government. We become responsible then for administrating, 250 million people. And there was no answers. No one had given any thought to economics. How are you going to clothe and feed these people? The only thing that I could get was that they expected that the Cubans and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Russians would all want to occupy different portions of the United States. They also believed that their immediate responsibility would be to protect against what they called the counter-revolution. And they felt that this counter-revolution could best be guarded against by creating and establishing re-education centers in the Southwest, where we would take all the people who needed to be re-educated into the new way of thinking and teach them how things were going to be. I ask, well, what is going to happen to those people that we can't re-educate, that are die-hard capitalists? And the reply was that they'd have to be eliminated. And when I pursued this further, they estimated that they would have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. And when I say eliminate, I mean kill. 25 million people. Now, I want you to imagine sitting in a room with 25 people, most of which have graduate degrees from Columbia and other well-known educational centers, and hear them figuring out the logistics for the elimination of 25 million people. And they were dead serious.